Slicers. When we have a pivot table, as we do here in this sheet, we can add slicers in order to help us show the different filters that we apply to the pivot table. Let's have a look at first inserting a slicer. To do this, we click anywhere inside the pivot table and we go up into the pivot table tools and we click on the Options tab. In the middle of the Options tab, you'll see an option to insert a slicer. When I click on this, I see the same headings as I saw when I was creating my pivot table. These are the headings that we have in our initial list. I'm going to add just one slicer to begin with, and I'm going to add the product slicer and press OK. This opens up a little panel on my screen, and when this is selected, I see the slicer tool options at the top. Be aware when you click inside the pivot table, you don't see the slicer tools, you only see the pivot table tools. So make sure when you're talking about formatting the slicer that you click on the slicer itself in order to see its options. First, let's look at what a slicer does before we start looking at the different options that we can choose. Here we see the product and we see the list of the 3 different products. If I select one of these products, the pivot table is filtered to only show that particular product. So you can see here, I can only see the desktop product. If I click on laptop, then it deselects desktop and puts in the laptop as a visible entity inside of the pivot table. And for example, mobile. If I hold down Control, I can select more than one at a time. So now we can see we're looking at desktops and mobiles. Clicking on the little funnel at the top will clear any filters, so that brings all of the products back onto the screen. A couple of options that we can change when we're dealing with the slicer. Firstly, we can look at the caption that's at the top of our slicer here, which says product. We might decide to change this to something like choose a product. So when I click return and I click away, I can now see that the panel here says choose a product, and I can click desktop to only show desktops, mobiles to only show mobiles, hold down Control to show both, etc., or click on the funnel to clear it. Again, if I select the actual slicer panel itself, I can go back up into options. Pivot table connections is just telling me the pivot table that this is currently linked to, which is pivot table 2. And also I have the different styles that I can apply to the slicer. And if I click on this drop down arrow, I see a gallery of different styles that I can choose. And these are just basically color schemes that you can apply to the slicer. The other handy option up here at the top is the number of columns that you want to see the list of, for example, products appearing in. The default is 1 column. If you up this to 2 or 3, you can see that it allows me to have columns within the slicer. This might be handy if you had numerous products and not just 3 like here in my example. Once you've got one slicer, you can add others. So for example, if I click back into the pivot table itself, go back into options and click insert slicer, currently we have the product slicer turned on. I'm also going to bring in the year, the salesperson and the region. And we can see now that these are all appearing on screen, and I can move them around to make them fit on my sheet. Clicking on each one, I can now go to the options of the one that I have selected. So for example, I might change for the year slicer, I might say to pick a year. And now that's what I see up here in the caption. Here I could change the caption to choose a salesperson, choose a region, choose a product. Once I've done all of that, I can then go in and I can change, for example, each of the slicers' color schemes. So in theory, I could give each one of the slicers a different color, and this may just help with the look or the presentation of my pivot table. So once I've done this, I can now start choosing the filters that I'd like to apply to my pivot table. So for example, I could choose a year, choose a salesperson, and then I can see only the West and only the mobiles are left because that's all Fiona has sold in 2013. Clearing each one of these, I can go back to see all of my data and then start again. So I could say only show me 2012 for Grania, Joanne and Lavina, and I can choose those three people by holding down Control. I can see still all region and all products are in place, so I could say only the North region, and I can see now that that has filtered away Monica and Shirley because they haven't sold in the North region, only Grania is left highlighted, and so on. So clicking on these little funnels will then clear my table and eventually get me back to looking at the full data again. Remembering that when I click on the pivot table, I see the pivot table tools, and when I click on a slicer, I get to see that slicer's options. To delete a slicer off the screen, just click anywhere inside the slicer and just simply press the delete button on your keyboard. And as I go through these slicers, I can delete each one and then just return back to my pivot table. Handy little tools, slicers. They are brand new in 2010, so you won't find them in any of the older versions of Excel. And they're very handy for things like presenting data to a group of people on screen in Excel because the data is easy to filter and easy to see the changes.